Pastor Wayne filling in for me last week, and I thought, he just did an amazing job. Wayne has been sending me study material ever since COVID hit. Wayne sends me a study material, and it's just such a blessing, all that he does for me. And then I was excited and so appreciative of the opportunity that he was to fill in for me last week, and I really appreciate it. It's great to have everybody here this morning, and everybody that's listening online. Appreciate y'all being with us too. It's just a blessing, and thank y'all. Anyway, well, thank you, Linda. I'm glad to be back. Guys, we're following up. Actually, it's hard to even imagine we're coming to the end of our spring quarter. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but it just seems like just time flies. I mean, it just goes so fast. But we're coming to the end of our spring quarter, and as everybody knows, we've been talking about sharing Christ and how to share Christ for the past 4 lessons, or 3 lessons, and this will be the 4th. But anyway, as we look into that, this morning's lesson is entitled "Live the Message." And the point of our lesson is how we live reflects on the message we share. How we live reflects on the message that we share. And guys, that hits home. So many of us struggle, and we've talked about this for the past several weeks and even way beyond that. But we struggle with witnessing. We struggle with talking to people because we're always worried about what we're going to say, or if we'll mess up, or they'll ask us a question and we don't, and that's hard, right? I mean, all of us know that's hard. But what every single one of us does every minute of every day is live our life. And there's folks watching, and we're coming into contact with. And so when we think about the point of the lesson is how we live reflects on the message that we share. Guys, I want to start out, I want to tell you 2 stories. Everybody that's been in my class before, everybody that's here probably have heard both these stories more than once. But I can't help but to share it again, especially in relations to what the point of our lesson is this morning. And both of the stories have to do with World War II. Both of the stories, if we think back 75 years from today, this country was in a mixed emotion, if you will. Victory in Europe had just been secured. I don't remember the exact date, but it was the very 1st of May. Germany had surrendered and victory in Europe was secured, but the fighting was still raging in Japan. And in my story this morning, my 2 stories are about 2 gentlemen that were smack dab in the middle of that. And one of them is a lot of you've heard of. His name was Louis Zamperini. And the movie Unbroken, that's the story. It was about his life. And I hope some of you have seen that movie. Just an incredible tale. But Louis Zamperini, if you've seen the movie or if you've heard anything, he was an Olympic runner, and he ran in the 1936 Olympics, the 1 mile, or no, the 3 mile. He ran the 5K, and the 1936 Olympics were hosted in Germany, and Adolf Hitler watched as Louis Zamperini ran his 3 miles and as an Olympic athlete. And he finished 8th as I believe a 17-year-old boy, and was so excited about the 1940 Olympics. And that was his goal. And the talk in the day was how this young boy would be a force in the 1940 Olympics. And if we know history, the 1940 Olympics were canceled because of what was going on in the world at the time. And so as a young man, we've all kind of talked about this too, but in the past several weeks. But you know, when your dreams are kind of smashed, you kind of find yourself drifting sometimes, right? I mean, and so Louis Zamperini found himself that way and wound up in the Army. And he was went into the Air Force and stationed in Hawaii. They sent his crew out looking for a plane that hadn't returned, and while him and his crew was out over the Pacific Ocean, their plane had trouble and crashed in the ocean. And Louis Zamperini spent 47 days on a raft, floating in the ocean. Now, I don't, that's just incomprehensible. But he survived. Didn't think he would. No, you know, one of his crewmates that was on the raft didn't make it. Two of them did. They survived 47 days out there, and only to be picked up by the Japanese. You know, so I don't know about y'all, but to me, you go through a terrible ordeal, and when you finally get rescued, and it's by the enemy. I mean, you talking about just getting stomped on and stomped on. I mean, but this man, Louis Zamperini, that's where he found himself. Survived 47 days on a raft to be captured by the Japanese. And then he spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp. And he was severely mistreated. The guy that was over the POW camp, they called him the Bird. And he was sadistic and evil. And to give you an idea of after the war, he was number 16 on the most wanted list of the Japanese for war crimes. And that was the man that was in charge of Louis Zamperini while he was in prison. It was this man that broke Louis Zamperini's leg to the point he couldn't ever run again. And his dream all this time when he was floating on the raft, the years that he spent in POW camp, he still had the dream of being a runner, to get to carry that Olympic flag for the United States. And this man took it from him. After the war ended, Zamperini came home. He was a hero because, see, the United States had listed him dead in 1943. His plane went down, no survivors, so he was, in essence, a dead man. He had been listed killed in action. And so then all of a sudden he shows up. And he's alive, he was a prisoner, and he was a war hero. Not that he wasn't in any other aspect, but the fact that he had been declared dead made it even that much more of a sensational story. He was asked to speak and travel the country, and but you know, he every night when he went to bed, he had nightmares. He had nightmares about that man that had took so much from him. And he made it his life goal to raise enough money to go back to Japan to kill that man. That was his life goal. That was his only goal, was to raise enough money and while he was in the United States to go back to Japan and to kill that man that haunted his dream. This hatred, this desire got so bad that his wife left him. He turned to alcohol. And one night, his wife, she came back, and the night before, she had been to a Billy Graham crusade. And in that crusade, she had given her life to Christ, and she invited Louis to come and listen. He said he wasn't going to do that. We know the story. We've all been there, right? At some point, fashion, we've all been there. He wasn't going to go. He was his own man, right? He survived what is unsurvivable. At the second night, she invited him again, and he went and gave his life to Christ. He started a boys' home for troubled youth. He got into youth ministry. What a great speaker, right? I mean, here you got a man that's seen what he's seen, lived through, and he's sitting there and he's ministering to young people. He goes to a young people conference in the Midwest. He's at that conference. He's been there. He spoke. He goes, get ready to go to bed that night. Somebody knocks on his door. And it was a group. And they said, Mr. Zamperini says, we've got this money we want to give you. He says, what's this money for? They said, the Lord's told us to give you this money to fund your trip to Japan. And he says, I'm not planning on going to Japan. I don't. And they said, well, the Lord's laid that on our heart to give you this money we've raised. And the next day, the head of this ministry where he was at came to him and said, Mr. Zamperini says, I need to talk to you. He says, I feel led to tell you that you need to go to Japan. And he did. He went to Japan, and he preached the gospel in Japan. Guys, there's a neat story that he went into the prison where they were holding all the prisoners of the folks that were wanted on war crimes, all these people. He went into the prison and preached to them. And he specifically asked if the guards at the facility that he was held at, if he could talk to them. This is what he says. He says, I looked out and I saw them coming down the aisle, and of course I recognized each one of them vividly. I didn't even think of my reaction. I jumped off the stage, ran down there, and threw my arms around them, and they withdrew from me. They couldn't understand the forgiveness. We went in the room, and there, of course, I continued to press the issue of Christianity, you see, and all but one made a decision for Christ. It says, one former Japanese soldier wondered how he could forgive these men who treated him so badly. Louis responded, I said, well, Mr. Sasaki, the greatest story of forgiveness the world's ever known was the cross. When Christ was crucified, he said, forgive them, Father. They know not what they do. And I said, it is only through the cross that I can come back here and say this, but I do forgive you. Then that gentleman responded to the invitation to become a Christian. Guys, that's amazing, right? You know, if you watch the movie Unbroken, it shows him getting out of the POW camp. They don't show the rest of the story. The rest of the story is the powerful part of Mr. Zambini's life. You know, the point of our lesson is how we live reflects on the message we share. He got that, right? I mean, you know, the neat thing about it as I conclude the story, please look it up, read it. Just Google. You ain't got to spell it right, I promise. Just put Louis Z-A-M something and it'll come up with his name. But the neat thing about that story, and I don't remember what year it was, I think he was 81. When the Olympics were in Japan, they invited him and he carried the Olympic flag and the torch to open the Olympics in Japan at 81 years old. What a great story. His dream was to carry the flag and torch as he was a young man running, and at 81 years old he went back to the country that he was imprisoned in and carried the flag and torch of the United States for the Olympics. That's pretty amazing. Google it, read about him, watch the movie. That'll show you the first part of the story. Really, really cool. The second person I want to talk about, similar story. His name is Jake DeShazer. I know I may have misspelled that. There again, Google his name. You ain't got to get it right. D-E-S something and it'll come up. Jake DeShazer. Jake DeShazer was he was involved in a little military operation called the Doolittle Raid. Everybody heard of that? Know the story? You know, Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, December. Took us by total surprise, terrible devastation for the United States. Not that, just morally, deep down, pride, I mean, that was bad. Japan then went through the Pacific Islands and the Philippines, and they were running rampant. And we were just incapable of doing anything about it. So this man named General Doolittle concocted an idea to attack Japan. It wasn't feasible. We had no way to get a bomber to Japan to do any damage to them. There's no way. The Japanese had already taken Midway, not Midway, but the Philippines. We had no airport to get a bomber to do anything to the mainland of Japan. Japan had attacked us, attacked U.S. soil. We had no way to do anything about it. This man, General Doolittle, decided he was going to take a bomber off of an aircraft carrier. People thought he was crazy. There wasn't no way you could get a bomber to lift off an aircraft carrier. Guys, we're talking 1942, right? And so he asked for volunteers. You couldn't be married. That was the number one thing. You wouldn't take any married people to be volunteers as pilots and crew to take bombers off of aircraft carriers. And they practiced, and they took all the weight out of these planes, and they made them where they didn't have nothing really but enough gas to get to Japan and bombs. And that was all they had. And so they finally got it down, and they made it where it could happen, and they practiced, and they put these bombers on on aircraft carriers. They sent them out in the Pacific, and you know what I said, they had enough gas to get to where? Japan. They didn't have enough gas to get back, because they couldn't take off on the aircraft carrier if they did. So these men voluntarily took off to go attack Japan. They knew it was They knew what was at stake. And they succeeded. General Doolittle and his men, they succeeded, and they attacked Japan. They didn't do much damage, truth be told. But it showed the Japanese that we could. And it showed the American people that we could. At a time when we had nothing but defeat, we had a victory. But these boys, when they bombed Japan, they turned around and they were going to try to make it back to some Allied held parts of China, because we know that Japanese had conquered a lot of China, but they were trying to make it back. And a few did and a lot didn't. And this man, Jake Deshazier, he was the bombardier on his plane, and it went down in China, and they were sure hoping. They didn't know where they was. They didn't have GPS like we do today. They went down, and they were just so hoping that they went down in some friendly areas of China, and their plane crashed, and they hid out till morning, and when the sun came out, they got caught, and it wasn't friendly Chinese that caught them. It was the Japanese. So if we think about Jake Deshazier and what he did, he was a prisoner of war virtually from the beginning of World War II. And he remained there until the end of World War II. But he was captured. In his captivity, obviously, him and his crews and his fellow crewmates and fellow pilots and crews, the Japanese wanted to make a point. These guys had come and bombed their homeland, and they made it a point to make them an example. Jake Deshazier's pilot, master gunner, they were stood up and executed. He watched. And then he was put in a POW camp for the remainder of the war, where if you read about him and read the biographies, this stuff just, it's cringing. Whereas they were made to clean the hog pens with their tongue. Think about that. They just the stuff they were forced and made to do is just unbelievable, really, how humans could treat other humans in that way. Jake Deshazier came upon a Bible by accident. And he read that Bible, and he had it for 3 days. And then in 3 days he gave his heart to Christ from having that Bible. And it says here, probably one of the most amazing quotes I've ever read. This is what Jake DeShazer said. He said, God gave me grace to confess my sins to Him, and He forgave me all my sins and saved me for Jesus' sake. Suddenly I discovered that God had given me new spiritual eyes, and that when I looked at the enemy officers and guards who had starved and beaten my companions and me so cruelly, I found my bitter hatred for them changed to loving pity. It's almost incomprehensible. But he began to look at the guards, and he began to look at them through Christ's eyes instead of his eyes. He began to see them as lost people that didn't know Jesus. The war came to an end, and he was freed from his POW camp. And if you read his biography, it says that he was walking out of the camp, and he looked around at all these people in Japan, and he seen hopelessness. Is all he saw in the people around him. And at that point, God stirred his heart. He got back to the United States. He went to missionary school in 1948. He returned to Japan as a missionary. He said, because I'd never in my life seen people that needed hope more than those people did. At his very first stop as a missionary in Japan, he stood up and he told them about Jesus. The first man that came down the aisle was named Mitsuo Fuchida. I know that name don't mean anything to y'all. It wasn't to me. Mitsuo Fuchida was the first man at Jake DeShazer's first stop to come down the aisle to give himself to Christ. This man is important because he led the raid on Pearl Harbor. Guys, think about that. So you had the man that was involved in the first bombing on Japanese soil preach a sermon, and the man that led the raid on Pearl Harbor was the first man that gave his life to Christ. The two of them became great friends and preached all through Japan. Guys, the point of our lesson this morning, how we live reflects on the message we share. I've given us the example of two men that how they lived reflects and reflected on the message that we share. I'm going to get into our verses now really quick. We're going to be looking at Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, and then jumping from verses 12 through 17. But in Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, it says, If ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. Set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth. For ye are dead, and your life is hid with Christ in God. So in verse 1, Paul is he's giving this message to the Colossians. And he tells them, if ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above. And I'm going to jump ahead to verse 2. It says, set your affections on things above. Paul is telling the folks, seek those things that are above. Love those things. Set your affection. Love those things that are above. Not on things on the earth, but on things above. He goes on to say at the end of verse 1, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. He's trying to make a point to them. Set your things, set your sights, seek those things which are above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. If when we seek things that are above, when we seek things that are heavenly, when we seek things, it's not a waste of time, is what Paul is saying. We're seeking after things, we're loving things, we're pursuing things above, and Paul uses the example of above, and above is where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. So where Christ is at, on God's right hand, when we seek things above, that's what we're seeking after. Is there anything, could there possibly be anything more important in this world than what's with Christ on the right hand of God? There is not. I mean, nobody can argue that. None of us in here can argue that. But then, at the end of verse 2, Paul says, not on things on the earth. You see, we struggle with that part. I'm going to get into a lot of things right here that kind of are jumping off our lesson a little bit, but in a way I think they're very pertinent. You know some things that I've heard inside of a church house, mainly because I've probably said them. I'll tell you. I've heard, if you don't take care of yourself, no one else will. How many of us have ever heard that? I've heard that in church. I've thought that in church. Probably said it in church. If you don't take care of yourself, no one else will. That's kind of an ironic statement for a Christian to make, ain't it?
I've always took care of myself when John passed away.
You have, Linda, and that's a testament for you.
Well, Betty didn't help. Betty helped me a lot too.
But think about it though, Linda May. We're saying if you don't take care of yourself, no one else will.
Nope.
What we're essentially saying is, it's up to who? It's up to us. And is that true? No. But it's something that we've said and we've thought, right? You know something else we hear in church? I've said, thought, judge not, lest you be judged yourself.
That's what I was going to say.
And then I think, yep, and those people that don't follow that, they got it coming. First thing out of my mind, right? Those people that don't obey this, they got it coming. What am I essentially doing? I'm judging them. You know, Felicia and Lonnie, they taught the lesson back in the winter, this idea, you know, we talked about the Sermon on the Mount. We talked about the Beatitudes. And that book, Felicia based her study on, what if Jesus was serious? You know, involved in something last weekend. I turned the other cheek. But yet I went home and spent a day and a half thinking of what I ought to have said, what I should have said, what I wanted to do. Yeah, I turned the cheek, but I spent a day and a half. Every time I closed my eyes, I seen the person that I turned my cheek from and thinking what I wanted to go back and say to that person, what I'd like to do to that person. Did I essentially really turn my cheek? No. Because if we go back to what Jesus said, it's not enough not to murder, but we don't hate. It's not enough to murder that we love our enemies as ourselves. That's what Jesus taught. Guys, how we live reflects on the message we share. We can't hide it. It always comes out. It always comes out. You know, these men that I gave you the examples of, when I tell the story, when I read the autobiographies, when I listen to the audiobooks, I get goosebumps hearing these men's stories. Because I think in my mind, I could never do that. If I had been in prison and treated cruelly for 4 years, the last place I would ever go is back to that place. How many of us? I don't think I'm the only one. The last thing I would care about is what happened to those people. But yet these men did. These men turned the other cheek. These men loved their enemies as themselves. And when we go back to the point of our lesson, how we live reflects on the message we share. Is there any way you could quantify the impact these men had on lives? The message they took impacted thousands and thousands and thousands of lives. And it's because they lived like, what if Jesus was serious? You know, this ain't easy. It's easy for me to, just like last weekend, it's easy for me to turn my cheek and pat myself on the back and think I did what I was supposed to do. And think I've done my duty. But Jesus said it ain't enough. It ain't enough. That we love our enemies. And if we can, as Christians in the United States, across the world, if we could live that way, if we could live the example that these two men I shared, if we could live like, if ye be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. Set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth. If we live that way, the lives that we would impact. You know why it's so hard to live that way? What are you saying, April? You didn't whisper loud enough that time. I couldn't hear you. April said,
our sin nature.
And that's exactly right. We're human, April said. Our sin nature. You know, it goes back to a month or so ago, 2-3 months ago. And we had the lessons and we were talking about the essentials of Christianity. And I guess it was back in March, we talked about the nature of sin. And I threw something out there that when you look at that, when you look at the nature of sin, when you go back to the very beginning, it's all about what? I, me, and my. Y'all remember that lesson? It's all about I, me, and my. You know, I got to thinking about that last night even more. I got thinking about the very first sin in the garden. And do y'all remember how the serpent tempted Eve? What did she say? What did the serpent tell Eve would have happened if she ate of that fruit? Does anybody remember?
She'd know what God knew.
She'd know what God knew. And so Eve had the desire to make herself what? Like God. And I got to thinking about something last night. You know, that's the basis of all sin. Because when I put I, me, my first, what am I essentially making myself?
As big as God.
As big. I'm making myself my God with a little teeny tiny g. Do you get that? I mean, I don't. Maybe it's just. But I kept going back to that last night. You know, this whole idea of I, me, my. It goes back even further when I talked about earlier about judging and the statement of judge not lest you be judged yourself. You know, when we judge others, what are we essentially doing? Who are we comparing them to?
Ourselves.
Is that not the truest statement I've ever heard? It never had hit me until last night. Never hit me until last night. When I judge others, I'm not judging them against anything else but myself. Therefore, when I judge others, I am making myself what? God. I'm making myself God. And it comes back to the base root of sin. Is I, is me, and is my. And April said the reason this is so hard is because we are all human. And we are of this world. And Paul said at the end of verse 2, not on things on this earth. So our struggle is to overcome it. Is there any discussions before we go on to our next group of verses?
There was a little guy East Coast service friend of her. He passed away. And Brittany was over at a conference room one day, and she said to you want to go to heaven? He said, I'd like to. And Brittany said, well, I said, you can. She said, let's pray. And she said, we confessed no Christ that day.
That's so great. That's so great, really. That's amazing. What a great story. But guys, you know, just one other point on those same lines. Felicia was teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. We got into some issues and treating others. And it goes back to that idea I said about why don't people see this is what Jesus really meant? And I see what it is, but they don't. And they're going to get it one day. Do you understand that? We do that, right? We say, okay, it goes back, Felicia taught on Wednesday night, and she used this word gola. I thought it was talking about soccer, but we wasn't. It was the name given to the remnant, to the exiles that came back from Babylon to Jerusalem. And it was this term gola that was given to them. And it's because they cared so much about establishing Jerusalem again. And they were so serious about it. And they were so dedicated that they went back and you know, this tremendous 100-year struggle to rebuild the temple and to build the walls back and to make Jerusalem and Israel a nation again. And they were given this term Gola because of how much and how dedicated they were. That's pretty neat, right? You know, we think about it, we think about this word Gola in that term. But yet, it was this same Gola that put Jesus on the cross. The same group that were so dedicated and believed and wanted to do everything as God had said and set it up and do it. Make sure the temple was built and the walls. It was that same group that were then unable to see when the Messiah did come. It comes back to us. The reason I'm using this as an example with the point of our message is that, and I'm just going to refer to myself, I begin to think that my Christianity and my holiness was something that I did and something that I earned, and therefore judge others accordingly. And as Christians, if we could get where we could see everyone through Christ's eyes and see ourselves through His grace, we could then live our lives in a way that reflects the message that we want to share. And that's the ultimate key point of our lesson. Any discussion before we go on, John? Well, we're jumping on to Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 through 15. And Paul says here in verse 12, "Put on therefore as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercies, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering, forbearing one another, and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. And above all these things put on charity, which is the bond of perfectness. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to the which also ye are called in one body, and be ye thankful." You know, I've hit on the things of the earth out of verse 2. But now Paul is breaking down what he's meaning by seek those things which are above. Set your affection on those things that are above. And then in verses 12 through 15, he's telling us what those things above are. And so verse 12 says, "Put on therefore as the elect of God, holy and beloved. He says, put on. It's like clothe yourself. It's like, suit up. It's what Paul is saying. Suit up as the elect of God. Holy and beloved. How many of us remember from several months ago, when we talked about a biblical vocabulary, a Christian vocabulary, we talked about the word holy. I'm not going to put you on the spot, but if anybody would like to remember, what does the word holy mean? Does anybody remember?
To be set apart from sin.
Exactly. Michael, you're exactly the first. Holy means set apart. It's what holy means. And so Paul is telling us, he says, suit up in verse 12. Suit up as the elect of God, holy and beloved, set apart and beloved. Not only are we set apart, but we're set apart and beloved. It ain't like we're in time out in the corner. That's set apart too, but that ain't holy and beloved. We're set apart, but then God's arms wrapped around us. And then he goes to say, the way that we suit up is being full of bowels of mercies, being full of kindness. We're set apart and we're suited up with humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering. Verse 13 goes on, forbearing one another and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. It doesn't say if some man has a quarrel against enemy, does it? What does it say? It says if any man. Do you see why I gave those examples to start our lesson this morning? Because I can't think of anyone else that had more of a reason to have a quarrel against somebody than them two men that I gave the example about. I don't think you could possibly come up with any other person that had more reason to have a quarrel against his fellow man than them two men did. But yet we see that they lived out verse 13, forbearing one another and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. I can't remember the quote. It was one of their two quotes. And they said that they had suffered and they forgive because Christ forgave those that afflicted him. The whole picture was gone. The whole picture of the cross is a picture of forgiveness. Christ, as he was hanging there, said, Father, what? Forgive them, for they know not what they do. It goes back to the idea, to the reality that Jesus could have came off that cross at any time. It comes back to the reality that Christ could have snapped his fingers and it had all been over. It goes back to the reality that the Son of God got beat by a mere man and he allowed it to happen. This same God that spoke and breathed the stars, that same God allowed himself to be beaten. He allowed himself to be mocked. And he allowed himself to be hung on a tree. And I think there had to be every bit of his flesh that just wanted to vaporize everybody around him. Does anybody else have that? We talk about Christ as a man, and every ounce of his flesh wanted to just make them all pay for what they were doing. Because I believe I think without a doubt in my mind, Jesus as a man felt that. And he had the power to do it. And yet he stayed there and he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Verse 13 asks us to forbear one another, forgive one another, and if any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. Verse 14 says, and above all these things put on charity, which is the bond of perfectness. Verse 14 is beautiful. Above mercy, above kindness, above humbleness, above meekness, above long suffering, above forgiveness, Paul says is what? Love. Exactly right, Michael. Above all those things is love. You know, I've sit there and I use Christ as an example. I've sit there and used Louis Zamperini and Jake DeShazer as an example. They could have done, Christ couldn't have stayed on that cross if it wasn't for what? For God so what? Loved the world. He couldn't have done it. He couldn't have done it without that much love for you. That's amazing. It's amazing. And Paul says, above all those things, put on charity, which is love, which is the bond of perfectness. You know, in 1 John, John says, perfect love casts out what? All fear. Perfect love casts out all fear. Do you realize, as a parent, when we love our kids, one of the greatest things we give them by loving them is we take what away? Fear. Can you see it? Have you ever thought of it that way? How many of us as a parent have ever had a child be scared of something and they come running to who? To you. And just being in my presence does what to them? Takes that fear away, right? John says that perfect love casts out all fear. As Christians, we are loved by a perfect love. And through that perfect love, we can have our fears cast away. But then Paul says, and above all these things, put on charity, which is the bond of perfectness. That love is the bond of perfectness. It goes back again to that it was love that held Christ on that cross. And that was perfect. Perfect love casts out all fear. Verse 15 says, and let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to the which also ye are called in one body, and be you thankful. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts. We can be fearless through perfect love, and through being fearless in perfect love, we can have peace in our hearts. And therefore, we can go and be long-suffering and merciful and kind and humble and meek. We can do all those things because we have had perfect love shown on us. Therefore, we can be fearless. Therefore, we can be at peace. How many of our lives are not peaceful right now because of things going on around us? Anybody not got that going on right now? And how many of those things going on around us that is making our life unpeaceful has to do with dealing with another person? Everything, right? We're given this opportunity. It's laid at our hands and our feet to live our lives humbly, mercifully, kind, meek, long-suffering, forgiving. We're given this, it's just laid out to us that if we do that, and we can do it because it was done for us, that we can live a life that is fearless and that is peaceful. We don't get it. I know you don't, because I don't get it yet. I mean, I just kind of scratch it a little bit. But the opportunity's there. It's 100% there for us if we just reach out and grasp onto it a little bit. You know, try it. Next time somebody makes you mad, next time it's a relationship with someone, you know, relationship ain't got to be, I mean, it can be any type of dealing with somebody that's bothering you, that's making your life unpeaceful. Say, God, I forgive them. I love them. I'm going to put them above me. And I guarantee you that peace will come into your life over that is. I mean, I promise it will. It may not resolve it, but if we treat every single person and continue to do it, you know what we do though? We'll try it one time and then, well, I give them their one chance. I mean, am I true or not, right? I mean, I give them their chance. But it's every time. Every time. You know, it goes back to the story of Louis Zamperini. He couldn't sleep at night. He had nightmares. He turned his life to hate. He turned his life, his sole purpose, to make money, to go to Japan, to kill the man that had tormented him in prison. The night he gave his life to Christ at the Billy Graham crusade, he said it all went away. There's situations in every one of our lives that's similar to that. Maybe not to that extent, but it's similar. And guys, I'm going to close really quick reading our last two verses. Colossians 3:16 and 17. It says, "Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. And whatsoever ye do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God and the Father by Him." In everything we do, if we do it for Him, if we truly did that, guys, then how we live would reflect the message we share. And so that's our challenge as we go through. I know it's not an easy one. I've done shared all my troubles. But that's what we're called to do. And I appreciate everybody. I look forward to next week. Our meeting next week is entitled Share the Message. And so I look forward to that. Thank y'all and have a great day.